Hi, how's life going? Do you really want to be immortal? I'm looking forward to your comments on this topic. Before answering, you need to watch this video to the end. This narrative begins with one of the most disturbing ideas in quantum mechanics. What if consciousness, from its own perspective, never truly experiences death? What if its child is temporary, reality drifting in another direction, and culture clinging to a living version? This idea, known as quantum immortality, frightens scientists because it's not science fiction, but theoretically possible. This fear doesn't stem from the idea of eternal life. It stems from questions of what consciousness is, how the self is situated within the universe we define, and how it is experienced realistically and subjectively. Quantum immortality fundamentally undermines the importance of humanity. This forms the basis of Hugh Everett III's interpretation of the multiverse, put forward in 1957. The measurement problem of quantum mechanics persists. A particle can exist in more than one operational state until it is observed. The observational event presupposes the collapse of this superposition. However, the cause and mechanism of this collapse have long remained a mystery. Everett's radical structure. The wave function doesn't actually collapse. Instead, its possible outcome actually occurs, but in separate universes. That is, we cannot obtain a single result where a measurement doesn't occur. Reality itself branches out. While one result is experienced in one universe, another result is experienced in another. All are equally real. This perspective implies that the universe is constantly branching out. Every quantum event, from the decay of a radioactive atom to the firing of a timer in our brain, creates new realities. Thus, not only infinite universes, but also infinite versions of yourself emerge. Here the idea of quantum immortality is born. If consciousness only experiences the surviving branches, then the personal perspective of the sun is never experienced. This thought chills scientists because the problem is not physical, but related to the content of consciousness. This inevitably raises questions about who we will be, what we will experience, and how what we call I will exist in the universe. Ultimately, this theory confronts us with something far deeper than death. If reality doesn't recognize a single line, if culture isn't limited by generations, and if every possibility occurs somewhere, then the numerical meaning of humanity may be far stranger and far deeper than its current form. The idea of multiple universes, seemingly a one-off encounter, met with expected resistance. Particularly, a small but determined group of physicists realized that, despite the peculiarities of this interpretation, it surprisingly solved many fundamental problems of quantum mechanics. This approach, in its broad scope, did not assign two separate, special, and privileged roles, but rather treated every corner of the universe as subject to the same quantum properties. One of those who took this seriously was Max Tegmark. In the 1990s, as quantum problems were being solved, he applied the multiple universes interpretation not only to cosmology, but also to death theory. If quantum phenomena branch off from reality, the probability of death creates a dividing line in the human eye. In most universes, it dies, but in at least one branch, it survives against all odds. This logic focused on the idea that consciousness exists only in the realities it can experience. That is, consciousness does not always choose the branches that survive from its perspective. Consciousness could not experience it otherwise. Based on this idea, Tegmark formulated the thought experiment known as quantum suicide. According to classical probability calculations, the chance of survival rapidly approaches zero. But from the perspective of multiple universes, consciousness is in a state of survival at every opportunity. From a subjective point of view, this implies functional immortality. Traffic accidents, wandering, getting lost, events that must be experienced, are like daily survival from the perspective of consciousness. However, while this idea seems promising at first glance, the real change begins here. Because quantum immortality does not guarantee a healthy, happy, or normal life. The survival of consciousness can be achieved through increasingly improbable, bizarre, and painful conditions. In every case where death is prevented, survival is usually possible through intense exercise, chronic pain, and unexplained medical miracles. Philosophers who modified this idea identified particularly disturbing scenarios. One of these was a state of existence in which consciousness was almost completely erased, interrupted only by very brief and fragmented transient moments. In this state, consciousness, like a fading light bulb, oscillated between existence and non-existence. As these branches progress, the world you inhabit becomes increasingly bizarre, artificial, and detached from the natural flow of nature. Your survival is no longer possible through ordinary cause and effect relationships, but only through the brutal mathematical logic of quantum mechanics. This creates not only physical survival, but also profound existential loneliness. The people you love become merely shadows existing on other branches. This loneliness is the fundamental element that makes quantum immortality frightening rather than promising. You survive, but you are cut off from shared reality. You are distanced from a world where meaningful relationships are possible. What remains is a consciousness that continues to survive, but is devoid of human connection. Even Max Tegmark, who proposed this thought experiment, has backtracked on some of its most extreme conclusions. Tegmark emphasized that death is not usually a sudden on/off event, but that consciousness typically fades slowly, gradually. As brain cells die and neural networks disintegrate, consciousness doesn't suddenly jump into a perfectly healthy parallel universe. Death is largely a biological process rather than a quantum one. However, even these objections do not eliminate the fundamental philosophical questions posed by quantum immortality. If consciousness can continue across parallel universes, what is it that makes you who you are throughout this continuity? Is the surviving consciousness still the same self? Or is it merely an illusion of continuity, a break from the past? Neuroscience has not yet fully explained what consciousness is, how it arises from the brain's physical processes, or why it produces the sense of you. Quantum immortality suggests that consciousness can transcend physical death. However, this assumption rests on unresolved grounds. Furthermore, the mathematical basis of the theory is fraught with serious problems. If all the possibilities in the multiverse interpretation actually occur, the meaning of the concept of probability becomes obscure. In a universe where everything exists, talking about some outcomes being more likely than others becomes a conceptual impasse. Therefore, the mathematical assurance offered by quantum immortality may rest on a chain of questionable assumptions rather than a solid foundation. For all these reasons, quantum immortality remains one of the most unsettling ideas in modern physics. Because if true, it would require a radical rethinking not only of physical reality, but also of what it means to be human, to exi. But this unsettling thought doesn't end there. Rather, we now descend to an even darker layer. We must confront the specific mechanisms proposed by quantum immortality, the scientific objections raised against the idea, and the broader implications of all this for our understanding of consciousness. Because it's not just about survival, it's about what reality is, where consciousness begins, and how much continuity what we call self possesses. At this point, the reasons why some physicists argue that the fundamental assumption of quantum immortality may have been flawed from the start become apparent. These objections may offer a small consolation to those uneasy about the idea. But let's pause for a moment. Let's allow ourselves to feel the weight of these ideas. Notice how your assumptions about existence, mortality, and the nature of your own consciousness are shaken. These are not comforting thoughts. Yet some of the deepest questions the human mind can grapple with lie precisely here. The picture becomes even more unsettling when we consider how quantum immortality should work in practice. We are encountering what scientists call the probability amplitude problem. In quantum mechanics, every possible outcome not only occurs, but also carries a mathematical weight. This weight represents the probability of finding yourself on a particular branch of reality. Let's say you survive a quantum suicide thought experiment. Yes, you're alive. Your consciousness persists. But the probability amplitude of that branch of reality is almost zero compared to your previous state. You continue to exist, but you are no longer at the center of reality, but on its edge. Think of it like a candle flame. With each miraculous survival, the flame dies down a little more, weakens a little more. It doesn't go out completely, but it becomes less noticeable. This represents an increasingly marginalized existence. As you move further away from the mainstream of the multiverse, the world you inhabit becomes stranger, more fragile, and more artificial. Philosopher Dr. Peter Lewis, who studies this phenomenon, describes it as a probabilistic, ghostly existence. You have consciousness, but your reality is so improbable that you become almost a shadow hovering on the edge of existence. From this, we arrive at perhaps one of physics' most difficult questions. What happens to your personal identity when you exist simultaneously in countless realities? According to the multiverse interpretation, every moment of your life branches out. You have a version of yourself drinking tea this morning, another version drinking coffee. You have countless versions of yourself choosing different paths, making different decisions, experiencing different outcomes. However, if the claim of quantum immortality is true, your conscious experience only progresses along the branches where you survive. This inevitably raises the question, is the person who fell asleep last night truly the same person reading these lines today? Or are you a quantum survivor carrying the memories of countless dead selves, living the illusion of continuity? As philosopher Derek Parfit suggests, perhaps what we perceive as self is not a solid object, but a flowing process, not a rock, but a river. Quantum immortality takes this idea to the extreme. Even if a person dies repeatedly and is reborn in parallel realities, a constant sense of identity can persist. If this is true, even as you read these words, countless versions of yourself may be dying in parallel universes. Heart attacks, accidents, disasters, all happening in different realms. While your consciousness only chooses the realities in which it continues to exist, listen and wonder. The loneliness implied by this thought is almost indescribable. The people you love are likely continuing to live in realms where you have long since died. To them, you are merely a memory. The probability of a version of you emerging and sharing the same reality diminishes over time. And perhaps the most terrifying point is this: if quantum immortality is real, as you age, not only you, but everyone you interact with, becomes increasingly trapped in improbable realities. The world begins to fill with shadows of probability, consciousnesses that continue to exist only because they are mathematically possible. Existence becomes less about living and more about clinging on. In this scenario, survival is no longer simply about existing. Your consciousness is preserved under increasingly artificial, fabricated, and lawless conditions under the relentless brutality of quantum mechanics. Your memories can be fragmented, manipulated, and your perception of time and reality can disintegrate like a broken film prop made up of discontinuous and fragmented consciousnesses. Many scientists, including the renowned physicist Max Tegmark, have rendered the perfect consciousness transition presupposed by quantum immortality untenable, emphasizing that death is a biological dissolution process rather than a sudden binary event. However, the theory raises profound and thought-provoking questions about what consciousness, identity, and remaining the same person actually mean. The continuation of time, your survival, becomes possible only through the emergence of more and more life. You survive accidents where everyone else should die, experience inexplicable miracles, and an impossibility bubble forms amidst the physical flow. This bubble protects you and traps you in an increasingly artificial and inconsistent reality, as if you were waiting for people in the history of developments abroad. In this case, reality can transform into a state where causality weakens. The suggestion of a break from physics becomes widespread, and you may be forced to constantly rewrite past events to preserve your fundamental consciousness. If this situation is not unique to this dimension, and the being inhabiting it possesses quantum immortality from its own perspective, it would need to produce an infinitely complex and artificial choreography of probabilities to survive simultaneously in all the details of the universe. This mixture of memories transforms your perception of personal history from a single life story into an inconsistent mosaic of events from multiple realities. Therefore, the sense of self, the concepts of continuity and identity begin to dissolve, and the individual becomes unable to discern which moment is truly their own. At the societal level, this theory has even more disturbing consequences. If some people experience the transformation of quantum immortality while others continue to live with normal mortal consciousness, society could split into two separate parts: those who believe in the absence of death and those who accept death as inevitable. These two groups are almost completely disconnected psychologically and visually, leading to the disappearance of a meaningful shared reality. Even more disturbing is the possibility that quantum immortality is not universal, but something possessed only by certain hidden beings. In such a case, the universe follows natural life cycles. Mortals die, transforming into a bizarre mixture of quantum immortals accumulating in increasingly improbable realities. And eventually, these immortal consciousnesses are left alone in realities where normal biological life is virtually impossible. In this place, immortality begins to appear not as freedom, but as a cosmic trap that aims to bind consciousness with increasingly nightmarish, detailed principles, indifferent to pain, understanding, or peace. but not entirely condemning it to the world. Furthermore, due to the observer choice effect, you can only observe surviving realities and create a self-reinforcing reversal scenario where physical life appears to turn in your favor. In this cycle, the universe doesn't actually become more miraculous, because only you and only miracles can exist in universes. Therefore, a new form of survival necessitates the next impossibility, and your reality increasingly deviates from natural life, transforming into a highly artificial construct that philosophers call a bubble of possibilities. At this point, even the birth and death of stars, the collision of galaxies, or the chaotic evolution of cosmic structures become a potential threat, because any flow of physical change could cease, transforming into a structure locked in large chunks within the range of reality, and the universe could be adjusted to static equilibrium temperatures that support consciousnesses emerging outside of a living system. Some theorists attempt to use this to understand why the universe seems so shallow for life. The question of why fundamental physical constants exist only within complex structures and suitably narrow ranges for observation is answered by the sustainability of quantum immortality in a reality already shaped by its intricate details. But this explanation comes at an extremely high price. If our universe is indeed shaped by these formation biases, then a natural universe, free from the biases of time loss, remains inaccessible, perhaps never observable, raising the unsettling question: is what we are studying the real universe, or is the observation process itself a radically distorted quantum illusion? In this case, our measurement, our conclusion, may be tainted by formation biases that we cannot perceive but cannot eliminate. And this psychological burden becomes almost unbearable when quantum immortality is truly grasped. For then, we are faced with the possibility that every experience of reality may be the product of an artificial arrangement that exists because it is compatible with our survival. Even the sunsets we see, value relations, the joys and sorrows of health may be byproducts of the minimum viable conditions necessary for the continuation of consciousness, and all the richness and complexity we perceive may be transformed from quantum mechanical compartments filled to sustain our universal existence. This is an expansion of the transformations that philosophers call the crisis of authenticity. If your existence is increasingly supported by artificial, intrusive, and improbable realities, at some point is what you are currently experiencing real life? Or have you transformed into a universal construct designed to preserve the consciousness of the universe? This will later be debated more harshly by some thinkers. These thinkers generally view quantum immortal beings as reality parasites that burden the naturally divided universe, because their continued existence requires the universe's miraculous survival, its impossibility, its accidental nature, and the bending of reality, and this support must be drawn from the universe's fundamental energy budget. From time to time, this cumulative cost affects stars, galaxies, and the natural cosmos. The unsettling possibility is that all of this is not merely a theoretical future scenario, but that some cosmologists believe traces of these rare selection consequences are already beginning to appear in the surprising features of our universe: the acceleration of cosmic expansion, the strange behavior of dark energy, and the fine-tuning of physical constants. If this is true, then what we are discussing is not a potential catastrophe, but a reality in its own spectrum. One of the most serious problems this theory creates is the issue of safety risk. If a person truly believes, from their own perspective, that they will never die, that they are protected, they may neglect risk avoidance or the seriousness of actions and lose the fundamental protection of traditional ethical considerations with the belief that consciousness always survives. This is not merely a theoretical concern. It has been documented that some individuals using quantum immortality have made dangerous and irreversible attempts to study the theory. And these individuals have further strengthened their beliefs by claiming that these experiments, which outwardly appear to be failures, were actually successfully completed in parallel realities where their own consciousness survived. Herein lies one of the most disturbing aspects of quantum immortality. This subjective theory can never be mismanaged, because one can only observe the realities in which one exists, and one's survival, one's miraculous freedom, is interpreted as proof of the theory's existence, creating a biased, self-reinforcing belief narrative. This unfalsifiable structure underlies more common behaviors, and, as some have pointed out, when combined with flaws in the anthropocentric formation of the mind, produces an irrational confidence that quantum mechanics will save consciousness under all circumstances. A belief that systematically ignores the fact that death is inevitable in the overwhelming majority of possible worlds. But perhaps the most important aspect of quantum immortality is what it implies about the content of consciousness. Theoretically, assuming that personal experience can maintain its continuous existence between parallel realities despite physical disintegration, a far more fundamental, even body-independent form of existence emerges where consciousness is merely a byproduct of neural activity. If it truly survives physical death and continues to exist in alternate realities, then there is no principle requiring the diffusion of consciousness, biological capacity, or even species-specific continuity. This leads to the mind being transferable to artificial intelligences, structures in machines, or entirely alien forms of existence, suddenly revealing highly disturbing scenarios, fluidized at the boundaries of personality. At this point, the very existence of personal identity begins to dissolve. If your consciousness exists in a machine, are you still human? If you are dispersed across multiple realities simultaneously, can we speak of a single you? Or is what we call self merely a temporary arrangement, creating the illusion of continuity? In these scenarios, which some authors describe as fragmentation of consciousness, a person can disperse from distant death to distant branches of the multiverse, becoming a dispersed entity experiencing multiple realities simultaneously. In this case, consciousness transforms into an unbearable cacophony where fragmented memories, lived lives, and surviving deaths are felt simultaneously. This kind of existence is the fundamental and obvious reason why many scientists researching consciousness find the concept of quantum immortality conceptually inconsistent. Because if politics is the ability to transition between realities, the question of what provides continuity as the same idea remains unanswered. At this point, the most fundamental question stemming from quantum immortality becomes inevitable. Are we conscious physical beings, or do we possess the potential to exist in a physical universe? Because the solution to this question determines not only whether immortality is possible, but also what existence means. Even if immortality seems theoretically possible, the real question is what is meant by immortality. This idea presents a distortion of probability so alien to human experience that it questions the existence of entities with the potential to fundamentally shake our fears about death, suffering, meaning, identity, and our perception of reality, even our understanding of existence. Therefore, quantum immortality is not merely scientific speculation, but a mirror reflecting our deepest fears about consciousness, reality, and the state of meaning. While daily crises, alternative theories, and the search for a way out of this intellectual prison continue, the current theoretical framework contains serious inconsistencies. At the heart of these criticisms is the probability fallacy, put forward by Dr. David Wallace of Cambridge University, which aims to undermine the perfection of quantum immortality. Quantum immortality. On the boundaries of consciousness, reality, and existence. This is a field we are only just beginning to understand. While it may seem like a purely theoretical discussion at first glance, its implications extend far beyond individual survival, to the nature of humanity, even to the very essence of human existence. If consciousness can indeed confront physical death through quantum mechanical processes, then the entire structure of reality may be far stranger and more complex than has been perceived to date. Perhaps what is universal in the universe, consciousness, is not merely a byproduct. It may be a fundamental property of reality. From this perspective, what is observed plays an active role in the formation of physical life, and the boundary between mind and matter is not as rigid as science has traditionally assumed. This leads us to question the nature of survival. The deepest question posed by quantum immortality is, what is the nature of existence? Are we conserved physical beings, or are we physically conserved beings? This question not only determines whether quantum immortality can truly exist, this also leads us to question the fundamental nature of existence. Is immortality possible? The idea of immortality is not simply the hope of escaping death. The real question is, what does it mean to be immortal? This question reveals our most fundamental fears about human existence. Quantum immortality radically shakes the picture of what constitutes reality, consciousness, and existence: the fear of death. This theory presents possibilities so alien to human experience that their very existence could shake our very being. Scientific criticisms and the logical inconsistency of the concept. Quantum immortality is not only an independent theory, it also faces serious criticism from the scientific community. These disagreements often involve intermittent debates or shifts in opinion, questioning whether the theory is self-evident. Doctor, from Cambridge University, David Wallace has extensively examined the quantum immortality debate, and his conclusions may be quite devastating. This theory may rest on a very fundamental fallacy called the probability fallacy. Quantum immortality assumes that consciousness can perceive and act upon the probability differences between parallel realities. That is, it assumes that your consciousness gravitates towards the branches with a higher probability of survival. However, this requires immense power for consciousness. Consciousness must possess knowledge about parallel branches that your current reality cannot access. In other words, your consciousness must be able to see, evaluate, and choose the most suitable branch among all other possible branches of reality. This implies that consciousness exists outside the normal values of space-time and literally functions like a cosmic calculator. This leads to a very fundamental paradox. If consciousness can receive information from parallel realities, the independence of branches, a fundamental feature of the multiverse interpretation, disappears. This could collapse the integrity of the theory. The fundamental problem: the inseparable link between consciousness and the brain. One of the most fundamental problems with quantum immortality is that consciousness is tightly linked to brain activity. This creates what neuroscientists call the underlying problem. If your consciousness is tied to a specific brain model, maintaining consciousness across parallel realities requires preserving not only awareness, but also the physical infrastructure that was actually produced. Therefore, this theory implies the copying of the brain, not the transfer of consciousness. This leads to a terrifying scenario. If quantum immortality produces copies of your brain on survival branches, what happens if the original you dies? What remains is a copy containing your memories, but not the original, a different entity. This leads to identity continuity. Are you the same person as your quantum copy? Or are you just different entities with the same memories? If the original you disappears and only the copies survive, quantum immortality becomes not eternal life, but an endless chain of death and suffering. The meaning of diseases and the measurement problem. Another important problem concerning quantum immortality is how to define probabilities in the multiverse interpretation. Because in this interpretation, the reality of possible outcomes is a realization. Then the question arises: if everything is happening, how can we close the question of whether some outcomes are more likely than others? Dr. Hilary Greaves from Oxford argues that this question fundamentally undermines predictions of quantum immortality. Since it is not possible to assign probability ranges within the framework of the multiverse, we cannot make a meaningful statement about which branches are more effective. This pushes the theory into an area where persistent differences become meaningless. Alternative interpretations of quantum mechanics. Quantum immortality is based on the multiverse interpretation. However, there are many interpretations of quantum mechanics, and most physicists prefer interpretations that do not require parallel universes. For example, the Copenhagen interpretation argues that quantum superpositions collapse upon measurement. Other alternative interpretations also render parallel universes unnecessary and quantum immortality impossible in general. If parallel realities don't exist and death never occurs, this would mean the permanent termination of consciousness. Quantum immortality, the dark side of consciousness, locality, and infinity. The idea of quantum immortality rests on the possibility of consciousness being transferred to a parallel reality. However, this idea brings with it a very dangerous paradox that epistemologists call the evidence trap. Because in theory, although it seems to be strengthened by a supposed new piece of evidence, this evidence is inherently unreliable because our observations are filtered by survival bias. That is, since you can only observe scenarios where your existence continues, it becomes almost impossible to evaluate it through the lens of reality. At this point, Dr. Nick Bostrom's work on anthropic reasoning comes into play. Bostrom explained in detail how a completely false impression about the possibility of survival bias can be created. If you can only observe your own survival within the realities you observe, it is almost inevitable that you will see yourself as having an extraordinary future or as being special. However, this is merely a result of the observer selection effect. But the criticisms of quantum immortality don't end there. This theory carries a much more worrying dimension, especially for its proponents. Because quantum immortality requires halting modern physics of consciousness and one of its fundamental principles, the principle of locality. The principle of locality argues that events can only interact within their own environments and that information cannot travel faster than light. This principle is one of the cornerstones of our understanding of space-time and causality. That is, the idea that events in one location cannot instantly affect another nearby location is one of the most fundamental principles of modern science. On the other hand, quantum immortality predicts that consciousness can acquire knowledge about parallel realities and the trajectory of the details of this information. In other words, you need to consciously communicate between causally unconnected universes. This violates the principle of locality so fundamentally that accepting the theory means not just accepting an idea, but rewriting physics. Dr. Leonard Susskind, a theoretical physicist at Stanford University, puts it quite clearly. Conscious choices alter the locality of any theory. This is a process that is insurmountable and encounters physical obstacles. Because such a process requires information processing far exceeding the division of the universe. Moreover, even acquiring such a large amount of information requires enormous energy. The body's energy resources cannot meet such a high energy demand. Quantum immortality requires continuous communication between parallel realities. That is, there must be continuous communication between branches. However, such communication practically requires infinite energy. Therefore, it is inevitable to conclude that quantum immortality is physically impossible within the framework of the current physics, science, and information system. The common conclusion of these technical criticisms is a rather harsh and clear claim. Quantum immortality is not only unproven, but also a hypothesis that contradicts existing principles. Accepting this theory would require abandoning a large part of modern physics. But even if we set aside all these technical discussions, there is another problem encountered with quantum immortality: empirical criticism. This criticism states that quantum immortality promises something no being could truly desire: an eternal existence under even more improbable, even more terrifying conditions. Dr. Thomas Nagel, a philosopher from New York University, argues that quantum immortality represents a fundamental misunderstanding of what is valuable in life. Because the meaning of life is largely shaped by its limited existence, finite properties, and ultimate end. The reality of death gives meaning to love, achievement, victory, and change. When death disappears, these fundamental psychological and emotional mechanisms collapse. Quantum immortal beings might experience a state that psychologists call existential boredom. Infinite time creates fewer and fewer options for continuous real experience, leading to a sense of meaninglessness. Because in a quantum immortality scenario, the formation and connections of life forms become unsustainable. When the people you love exist in your natural realities, versions that maintain continuity in your quantum immortality timeline become increasingly rare and improbable. This means that the effort a reality makes to preserve your consciousness condemns you to a completely isolated and solitary existence. Some researchers call this the isolation theorem. Because the longer you are exposed to quantum mechanical interference, the further you become from real human connection, and the more you become trapped in an increasingly alien, artificial existence. Dr. Bernard Williams, a moral philosopher from Oxford, describes the fundamental problem in immortality scenarios as categorical boredom. Because in an infinite existence, a point is reached where nothing new or interesting remains. Quantum immortality exacerbates this problem because it involves not only immortality, but also entrapment within reality. Deep criticisms of quantum immortality, consciousness, neuroscience, and the collapse of meaning. The strongest criticisms of the idea of quantum immortality actually come directly from studies of consciousness. This is because the theory assumes that consciousness exists as a single, unified thing that can be preserved and transferred from one place to another. However, modern neuroscience argues that awareness is neither a single, unified entity nor a transferable one. It suggests that consciousness is far more fragmented, far more fragile, and far more processual. The work of leading neurologist Dr. Antonio Damasio at USC shows that consciousness consists of numerous parallel processes that can independently decay. Each of these versions is a different level of damage response, and therefore, the idea of a central self that can switch between realities is directly challenged by Damasio's findings. Here, there is not a single central subject, but a universal entity arising from the dynamic interaction of different neural bursts. This distributed product of consciousness conceptually undermines the concept of quantum immortality. Because the question of to what events can consciousness be transferred to parallel realities depends on the validity of the theory. Solutions such as memory, power, sensory experiences, and emotional responses are independently susceptible to damage. This shows that consciousness is not an object that can be preserved, but a process that does not continue as long as it exists. Even preserving the physical infrastructure in this region does not solve the problem. Because the network structure and continuity are complex, not only neural changes, but also the dynamic generation of these connections make the experience of consciousness possible. Research on brain hemispheres reveals how easily information can be fragmented. When the connection between brain hemispheres is broken, the devices can exhibit two separate cultural analyses. This shows that consciousness is not a single, unified entity, but can even be divided within a single brain. If consciousness can be so easily divided within a single brain, the idea that it can preserve its parts between parallel universes becomes even more absurd. Michael Gazzaniga's research argues that information is better understood not as a single whole, but as a collection of ordered modules. Each module processes specific types of information and appears independent of the others. This modular perspective makes the transfer of consciousness almost impossible because only one entity remains to be transferred. Another fundamental flaw of quantum immortality is the timing problem. Even in idealized quantum suicide scenarios, death does not occur. Neural activity signals the loss of information and experience. There is no mechanism to transfer memories or experiences to the survival branch in this process. The fact that this choice is entirely arbitrary and uncertain undermines the basic logic of quantum immortality. Even if consciousness emerges during the death process, your surviving self may miss important memories, experience changes in personality traits, or suffer psychological damage from trauma resulting from near-death experiences. In this case, the continuing consciousness may become such a different entity that survival becomes meaningless. because it will not be you, but only another consciousness possessing your memories. These global and economic criticisms constitute a destructive force against quantum immortality. This theory contradicts fundamental principles such as locality, conservation of energy, and information theory, and leads to psychologically unbearable and existentially meaningless conclusions because it proposes a thought model incompatible with neuroscientific propositions. But what is truly disturbing is that this theory, even if wrong, can be defined as a template in itself. This reveals something far more disturbing than existence itself. For the real fear is not that quantum immortality is real. The real fear is the possibility that the mathematics of reality could be so bizarre as to produce the most fundamental and challenging ideas about life and death. This situation means confronting the possibility that consciousness, existence, and reality may be far more alien and unknowable. How much can we truly understand about consciousness, reality, and our place in the universe? Are there details of existence so fundamental and alien to human experience that we can never fully grasp them? Dr. Colin McGinn, a philosophy professor at the University of Miami, suggests that consciousness may be cognitively closed to human understanding. Just as a dog, no matter how intelligent, cannot understand quantum mechanics, there may be a limit to the true nature of our consciousness that we can never fully comprehend. If McGinn is right, theories like the immortality of quantum mechanics may be a symbol of humanity's encounter with its own methods. We can formulate concepts as formulas, examine their mathematical consequences, but we cannot truly understand what they mean for hidden experience. This limitation of security is possible in the diffusion created by quantum mechanics. The idea of quantum immortality is a thought that challenges the human imagination and forces us to consider possibilities that our brains were not designed to evolve. Therefore, quantum immortality emerges as a concept tested within the limits of the human mind, beyond scientific debate. Quantum immortality, consciousness, ignorance, and the dark mirror of existence. Regardless of whether the quantum immortality theory is technically correct, its profound impact is actually another phenomenon. This theory acts like a mirror, allowing us to reflect the nature of consciousness and the appearance of reality. That is, this thought is not merely a physics speculation. It is also a mirror that confronts us with the possibility that existence itself may be far stranger and more unknowable. This theory reveals the possibility of a reality far more complex and incomprehensible than what our daily lives show us. Facing the limits of human understanding creates a different kind of existential escape. Because we, as those who understand consciousness, attempt to comprehend infinity as hidden entities and finite minds. As creatures of time, we have no problem with infinity while grappling with our own limitations. Seriously considering quantum immortality reveals just how little we actually know about the manifestations of our own existence. But perhaps there is a kind of value in this understanding. The breakthrough created by quantum immortality also leads to a sense of intellectual humility. It allows us to acknowledge that reality is far beyond our ability to fully comprehend it. When we confront these ideas that push our minds to their limits, we can explore both the limits of human knowledge and the infinite mystery that lies beyond those limits. This will be scientifically marketed and produced. The quantum immortality debate will become a gateway to deeper discussions about reality and our place in the cosmic order. It forces us to question our actions, to confront and accept our limitations. Because quantum immortality, as an idea that reveals how profound the mysteries of life and even the development of fundamental experiences are, forces us to remain forever in visual appearances. At this point, the real shift begins to be understood. Is there somehow a possibility of eternal life? The real way out is to be different from consciousness, which is the basis of our experience and remains inherently mysterious. What kind of knowledge? How does it exist? And to know what it means for this existence to continue or to end. This parallel reveals a more subtle but deeper way out than the vivid nightmares created by quantum immortality scenarios. Whether existence exists without understanding it, that is, the way out of being on the ground and understanding something. Consciousness is the different faces existing within a reality whose characteristic features exceed our capacity. Consequently, what frightens scientists about quantum immortality is not the threat of trapping us in an eternal existence. The real fear is that this theory reminds us how little we understand the characteristics of existence. This theory is a dark mirror reflecting our ignorance about consciousness, reality, and what it means to live a real life. Sometimes, in this strange and incomprehensible universe, perhaps we find a kind of peace in accepting this ignorance. If consciousness is truly mysterious, and our understanding of reality extends far beyond its reach, then even the questions and nightmares that trouble us are meaningless. For quantum immortality scenarios may actually be a product of our limited perspective. Perhaps the universe is stranger, more complex, and at the same time more wonderful than our fears suggest. For perhaps the universe operates according to principles that transcend both our hopes and our fears. The mystery remains vast and unsolvable. You must wait in the quantum shadows of reality. In this wait, in this unknown, we find the only authentic proposition that can be offered in the deep investigations where quantum immortality emerges. Wonder, humility, and a profound appreciation for the regime in miraculous plants. Even if we cannot fully understand what our existence means, our existence itself carries meaning. In this silent disruption, we are confronted with systems that are among the most disturbing paradoxes of physics. These paradoxes reveal the meaning of existence. Trying to escape quantum immortality might be our downfall, or perhaps it will trap us there. Despite being the physicist most closely involved in the formulation of quantum immortality, Dr. Max Tegmark long tried to distance himself from the theory's creator. Through interviews and academic papers, he attempted to explain why the theory didn't work, why consciousness couldn't transition between realities, and why all its components operated within a persistent illusion. However, his efforts to disprove quantum theory proved fruitless. The persistence of immortality revealed an even more disturbing aspect. The more scientists tried to disprove quantum immortality, the more they discovered that attempts to escape it were actually ongoing, already taking place. This phenomenon, which researchers call the refutation paradox, perhaps illustrates the best possible outcome of the entire theory. If you have already achieved quantum immortality and your consciousness is increasingly trapped in improbable realities, even your attempts to scientifically refute the theory become part of the quantum mechanical conspiracy aimed at ensuring your continued existence. The cosmic dimension offers seemingly convincing counter-arguments against quantum immortality, because these arrangements help preserve your sanity by laying the groundwork for your own mortality. Quantum immortality, the existence of reality and the infinite fear of consciousness. In a simulation of quantum mechanics, reality might possess an order that constantly rewrites itself, so that those who must survive, those who must face death, can continue to exist. Reaching such a quantum reality is unimaginably impossible. It would require the universe to calculate an infinite number of possibilities for every moment, event, and observation, and to malfunction like a gigantic computer. For everything to exist, the universe's infinite number of equations would have to be broken, and all possible events would have to be constantly observed and kept in harmony by quantum immortal beings. In this case, reality would appear less like a natural evolution and more like the forced maintenance of a seemingly impossible order. This is similar to a complex video game involving the hardware and software systems of the universe. But the real fear lies somewhere we could never have imagined before. What if quantum immortality is not a flaw in the reality system, but an intrinsic property of the system? And what if consciousness, rather than being a byproduct of quantum mechanics, naturally exhibits quantum immortality as an inevitable consequence of its existence? Some theoretical physicists have even suggested that consciousness might be a bestowed beauty in the universe, like energy or momentum. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed from one form to another. Similarly, consciousness might be something that can persist independently of the fate of individual brains or bodies. Dr. Roger Penrose, a mathematician and physicist at Oxford University, has suggested that consciousness might involve quantum processes more fundamental than classical physics. If consciousness is indeed quantum mechanics at its core, then it could naturally resist the classical path of death and manifest itself in new ways. Among these ways is the possibility of preserving continuities from quantum forms that classical physics cannot predict or prevent. This possibility of quantum immortality is merely a strange theoretical curiosity, a phenomenon where a part of reality is transformed into something manipulable. Perhaps consciousness is the universe's way of observing itself. And this observation plays such a fundamental role in cosmic evolution that reality makes extraordinary efforts to preserve consciousness. The consequences of these thoughts are the emergence of every quantity of existence. If consciousness is immortal by nature, then death may not be a sun, but merely an illusion. It may be seen not as a permanent interruption, but as a temporary break in knowledge. Every day you lose your energy under anesthesia, and the centers in the city where you live in your daily life reveal the possibility that consciousness can continue, that new branches can be followed, that your consciousness can leap between realities. This leads to what philosophers call the illusion of continuity. When a person wakes up as the same person they were when they fell asleep, a continuous self is experienced. In fact, a quantum mechanical structure can be formed. The person who wakes up may be a quantum continuation of the person who fell asleep. Even if they share memories and identities, it is possible that reality exists in a slightly different realm. Every morning may be a calendar of resurrection. The final moment may be a miracle of quantum mechanics. We do not simply exist. We are constantly being recreated with programming limitations. This is the continuity of any universe. So, given the natural immortality of personal consciousness, why does the possibility of quantum immortality worry us today? The answer may lie in what psychologists call the problem of the reality of immortal existence. Because we evolved to value experiences that seem real, relationships that seem to be happening, and achievements that seem meaningful. Quantum immortality threatens these values. If your survival depends on an increasingly artificial reality, if it continues only on improbable branches sustained by quantum mechanical intervention, if your achievements occur in temperature worlds instead of natural evolution, then what is the point? Fear is not death. Fear is the infinite possibility of immortality. Dr. Thomas Nagel has written extensively on the subject, highlighting the absurdity of the chasm between humanity's search for meaning and the universe's apparent indifference to this need. Quantum immortality widens this chasm further, because instead of living a short, perhaps meaningful life in a universe filled with indifference and infinite absurdity, it might be possible to be trapped in an eternal existence within increasingly artificial and unnatural realities. When we consider what would happen to human relationships in quantum immortality scenarios, the social consequences become even more disturbing. Love, friendship, family ties, all are bound by common rules. These rely on limited and valuable information for the time we spend together. If we remove this limitation, the urgency, sensitivity, and mobility of employees also disappear. Furthermore, if everyone potentially possessed quantum immortality, the flow of humanity would become a waste of immortal elements, acting as if they were living normal mortal lives. Relationships would become a performance. Every emotion would become a simulation. Every connection and misbehavior would perpetuate the illusion of normal human existence. Even the children you love may only exist as details of your own nature. They grew up without you and lived full lives. Their continuing versions become increasingly less likely shadows on your quantum immortality timeline. Over time, real people become increasingly less visible quantum mechanical constructs. Quantum immortality, the eternity of suffering and the loss of hope. The perspective remains unchanged. The suffering continues. The agony persists. Units of consciousness slowly progress without the mercy of some kind of ultimate end. The agony of this process is that it becomes a never-ending cycle. For death has become not a liberation, but a distant possibility. Dr. Atul Gawande, a surgeon and author who has done extensive work on the fatal illness summary, has written extensively on this subject. Gawande emphasizes that death is accepted, that it is a prerequisite for living a good life. If the immortality of quantum mechanics means that we refuse to accept death, then we may also be refusing the process of living a dignified and meaningful life. Because accepting death determines and defines the quality of life. Does the inability to accept death lead to what the human mind can achieve? This is a shift that psychologists call existentialization. If you have truly become enriched to a permanent point, if your actions, choices, and decisions will echo forever, then making decisions becomes impossible. In a reality stretching towards an infinite horizon, how can a human being make decisions? Therefore, the temporal dimension of quantum immortality creates additional layers of dispersion. Throughout your existence, your perception of time can become increasingly distorted. In increasingly complex particle-like realities, time can transform into personal infinities as quantum mechanics attempts to solve increasingly impossible survival scenarios. You may experience a state where your perception of time changes, a state that researchers call temporal disintegration. In this state, a break begins in objective time. Your consciousness becomes a record of increasingly unstable realities, where minutes pass like hours, hours like years, and years like centuries. These temporal loops add another dimension to the nightmare. Quantum mechanics is disordered because it lacks the ability to choose between possible futures, is prone to reprocessing past events, and traps you in scenarios that repeat with minor changes. These loops can cause you to relive the same day, the same conversation, the same moment of crisis over and over again. While each repetition is slightly different, it is not fundamentally the same. Theoretical physicist Dr. Michio Kaku, who studies time and readings, has spoken of quantum temporal prisons in his speculations on consciousness, where consciousness is trapped in repeating loops, hindering its progress through time and leading to the termination of consciousness in all futures. These temporal prisons may explain some of the confusing records of human experience. For example, the feeling of déjà vu, the sensation of having lived the same moments before, moments when time inexplicably slows down or speeds up, the strange continuation of certain events, memories that seem to exist outside the norm of time. Such experiences may suggest the existence of quantum temporal prisons. But perhaps the deepest horror of quantum immortality lies in what it reveals about the consequences of hope. In human experience, hope is tied to the possibility of change, to potential, the chance of improvement, the end of individuals, and the emergence of meaning. Hope rests on these. But quantum immortality threatens to eliminate all these possibilities. If you are increasingly trapped in improbable realities, and your existence depends on quantum mechanical interventions that don't care about your well-being, then hope becomes meaningless. Because you cannot change the fundamental payments. You cannot permanently improve your conditions. You cannot escape the quantum mechanics of your existence. My friend's disappearance creates what existential philosophers call metaphysical despair. This is a form of despair that transcends individual psychology, an extremely profound despair. Because you no longer simply feel despair, you exist in a reality where hope is impossible, a reality far removed from it. The religious and spiritual implications of quantum immortality are equally disturbing. Most spiritual traditions offer the possibility of transcending the limitations of individual existence, a kind of transcendence, a hope for union with the whole, a glimmer of hope for spiritual evolution. But quantum immortality confines consciousness to the most limited, individual, and distant form of existence possible. There is no possibility of union with a greater reality. There is no chance of transcendence, no hope of spiritual evolution. You are forever locked into your personal perspective. You cannot transcend the limitations of your own consciousness and connect with something greater than yourself. Thus, you become trapped in an increasingly artificial existence. Dr. Ken Wilber, a philosopher who explores consciousness and spirituality, has described quantum immortality as the ultimate spiritual nightmare. Because, although it may seem like a state of existence that preserves beauty, without consciousness, all possibilities for growth, connection, or transcendence disappear. However, even while considering these cosmic consequences, we must remember that quantum immortality is, for now, only a theoretical concept, extensive speculation. In reality, there is no connection. The interest rates we are examining remain unchanged. The logical problems persist. The practical impossibilities continue to increase. However, the very fact that we can formulate such concepts speaks volumes. The human mind's ability To grasp these impossibilities reveals something profound about the nature of consciousness. For we are beings capable of imagining our own infinite suffering, of envisioning the vast scenarios of our understanding. Understanding is a quality that questions the foundations of our beliefs about existence. This capacity for self-transcendence may be one of the most remarkable aspects of human consciousness. For we gain knowledge about the possibilities that our universal environment can hold, and we also gain knowledge about ourselves as we confront the deepest and darkest possibilities of existence. The ideas of quantum immortality, whether technically correct or not, confront our consciousness with a profound ignorance about reality and existence. This theory is not just a scientific theory. It is also a mirror that pushes the limits of human control, allowing us to understand just how strange our universe can be. Perhaps the real solution is not to fear infinite existence, but to grasp existence itself. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more similar content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to stay updated on new videos. You can watch the next video by clicking on any of the videos displayed on the screen. Goodbye.